Hello YouTube, this is Corey Newman. Today I will be talking about my history thesis from Stockton University. I will be doing a reading of this thesis. Stockton University. Title: Highlands Air Force Station, Highlands, New Jersey, and its role in the air defense in New York City, 1948 to 1974, an operational history. A thesis in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Bachelor of Arts Historical Studies by Corey Newman, May 2nd, 2018. Table of Contents. Introduction. General Cold War History and a short discussion of sources, page 1. Chapter 1. A short history of National Cold War Air Defense, page 7. Chapter 2. The defenses of New York City during the Cold War, page 25. Chapter 3. Command and Control, Exercises, and What the Soviets Thought, page 44. Chapter 4. The History of the Highlands Air Force Station, page 64. Conclusion, page 84. Bibliography, page 89. Introduction. General Cold War History. The defense in New York City during the Cold War from atomic-laden bombers of the Soviet Union was one of America's greatest feats of military strength after World War II. This is a brief history of the air defense in New York City, as told from the vantage point of a radar station and later a command and control base in Highlands, New Jersey, for this defense from Soviet bombers. First, to put this defense in its proper context, we must understand the time period of the Cold War. For the purpose of this paper, I define the Cold War as the period from the first explosion of the atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945 to the fall of the Soviet Union in July 1991. Michael Polano dated the Cold War from the beginnings of World War II in September 1939 to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. John Lewis Gaddis set the Cold War from 1947 to 1991. This paper covers the period of 1948 to 1975 of the Cold War. Second, we must define air defense. The Merriam-Webster's Dictionary definition of air defense is the means, techniques, and organizations devoted to preventing or minimizing the effects of attack by enemy aircraft or guided missile. There are three main elements to air defense: aircraft warning, fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft artillery. Aircraft warning is detection of enemy aircraft either by radar or civilian ground observers. Fighter aircraft used in an attacking role against enemy bombers, being guided to the enemy bombers by radar station aircraft controllers that are used for area defense. Anti-aircraft artillery guns and missiles used for the last line point defense against enemy bombers. Tying all this together are command and control systems. The command and control, as defined by Patrick Gandy, is an integrated system comprised of doctrine, procedures, organizational structure, personal equipment, facilities, and communications which provide authorities at all levels with timely and adequate data to plan, direct, and control their operations. With the advent of the jet engine for aircraft, more than doubled the speed of aircraft after World War II. The additional aircraft speed meant that the warning times would decrease and that the information about an air battle would develop faster than an air commander could handle under the World War II system. The advent of nuclear bombs meant that a single bomber could devastate a city or a military base, so a successful defensive air battle required an interception rate as close to 100% as possible. Nuclear bombs now made mass bomber raids obsolete. A single bomber could destroy an entire city. In this thesis, I used primary sources from the Air Force, Army, and National Archives, and secondary sources from books, select doctoral and master's theses, papers, and the Internet. I've acquired these sources over many years of dedicated research. Many of these primary sources have never been researched or utilized for publication after their initial declassification. The secondary sources typically have not dealt with the full dimensions of air defense or deal with only one aspect of air defense, such as Nike anti-aircraft artillery missiles or fighter aircraft. Chapter 1 is a broad outline of American Cold War national air defenses. This encompasses the radar network, fighter interceptors, and the anti-aircraft artillery guns and later Nike missiles. This also briefly touches on the command and control systems of SAGE and Missile Master. The chapter after that is an overview of the units involved in the air defense in New York City. The argument discusses how the defense of the city developed during the Cold War across the three aspects of air defense. It also covers how many nuclear weapons were in place to defend the city during this time. Chapter 3 is an overview of air defense command and control procedures, including select air defense exercises between the Air Defense Command and the bombers of the Strategic Air Command. I also discuss what the Soviets thought of American air defenses. Chapter 4 is a specific history of the Highlands Air Force Station and its role in the air defense in New York City. The contributions of this chapter is that it details the radar and command and control history as experienced in the defense in New York City. The full thesis agrees with much of the current scholarship on national air defense, but suggests further research should be conducted on the radar and identification aspects of air defense. It also contributes a close study of an important site that represented U.S. Cold War deterrence. There were several general Cold War events that had an impact on national air defense to put this defense in the much larger context of the Cold War. The first two events were the advent of Soviet air power. First, the Tu-4 Bull bomber, followed by the Soviet explosion of an atomic bomb. The next event was the start of the Korean War at the end of June 1950. This event caused large amounts of money to be appropriated by Congress for defense spending during the 1950s. The Strategic Air Command received the largest share of the military budget in the 1950s, followed closely by air defense. By 1963, the U.S. was spending approximately $2 billion a year on air defense. In a March 1950 estimation of Soviet atomic capabilities, it was stated that the Soviet Union would have an estimated 10 to 20 atomic bombs by the end of the year, with an estimated 415 Tu-4 bombers. It was estimated in NSC 68 in April 1950 that in 1951 the Soviet Union would have an estimated 25 to 45 atomic bombs. By the end of that year, with an estimated 985 Tu-4 bombers. This was further estimated that in 1952 the Soviet Union would have 45 to 90 atomic bombs by the end of the year, with 985 Tu-4 bombers. The 1953 projection was an estimated 70 to 135 atomic bombs with 1,200 Tu-4 bombers. By the end of 1954, the Soviet Union would have an estimated 120 to 200 atomic bombs and 1,200 Tu-4 bombers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff picked 1954 as the year of maximum danger. In May 1954, the Soviet Union unveiled a new long-range bomber, the Bison. Unlike several other Soviet post-war aircraft, the Bison was not a derivative of U.S. or British designs, but represented a native Soviet design capability that surpassed U.S. intelligence experts. The new long-range jet bomber, along with the Soviet Union's large numbers of old propeller and turboprop bombers, seemed to pose a significant threat to the United States. The next year, the Soviet Union unveiled the Tu-95 Bear bomber. It is still in use today. It had the range to hit the United States. In the mid-1950s, this sparked public debate and numerous newspaper articles about a bomber gap. A July 1956 overflight by a top-secret U-2 spy plane put the bomber gap to rest. A CIA history of the U-2 spy plane stated that the Air Force claimed there were nearly 100 new Soviet Bison bombers stationed at 9 airfields, but the U-2 photographs proved the Air Force wrong. The Strategic Air Command had asked for additional B-52 aircraft, but that request was denied by the Air Force, by the White House, because of these top-secret photographs. In November 1956, members of Congress grumbled that the estimated numbers of the Soviet Bison bomber had been lowered just to keep defense spending down. The members of Congress did not know about the U-2 and could not know because of the secrecy of the program. The bomber gap was false, and the U.S. clearly was clearly ahead of the Soviet Union. This overflight and later intelligence affected the fighter aircraft force too. The number of fighter aircraft needed for national defense steadily declined after this. The next event was the 1957 launching of Sputnik by the Soviet Union and the advent of the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM. This event did not have an immediate impact, but led to the space race of the 1960s and was an issue in the 1960 presidential election debates between Kennedy and Nixon. The missile gap, known as the missile gap. This changed U.S. national defense in that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara accepted the value of the ICBM and began cutting national defense funding for air defense. Also, by 1965, money that would have been spent on air defense was diverted to fund our growing commitment in Vietnam. The Soviet Union did not reduce their bomber force because of the advent of the ICBM. Again, the missile gap was proven false, but with later spy satellite photographs of the Soviet Union. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in October. This event caused the emergency shifting of air defense forces to Florida and the southern United States. Several air defense units were temporarily moved from the defense in New York City to Florida during the crisis. The growing commitment of the U.S. in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s caused a clear decline in the air defense budgets and forces available for continental air defense. Another aspect that must be mentioned about the decline of the continental air defense forces in the 60s is that better technology, better fighters, radars, nuclear-armed air defense missiles, and computer technology made air defense more efficient and more effective. A commander could defend more with less forces. The joint use of radar sites and later integration by the Federal Aviation Administration and the Air Force also contributed to this decline in the later 1960s. The massive cutting of the defense budgets after Vietnam in the early to mid-1970s was the final cause of the decline of national air defense. A more detailed discussion on the dismantling of air defense network will be mentioned in the conclusion. Chapter 1. A short history of Cold War air defense. In March 1946, in a reorganization of the military after World War II, the War Department created the Air Defense Command, Strategic Air Command, and the Tactical Air Command. The Air Defense Command was assigned by the War Department the mission of the air defense of the United States under the Army Air Forces and was commanded by General George E. Stratemeyer. Upon taking command and getting his mission, General Stratemeyer discovered that the same mission was given to the Army Ground Forces at the end of World War II. A lengthy debate over who would control the air defense of the nation and how it was to be accomplished ensured over the next 2 years in the Pentagon. The general theme of the argument was that the Army Air Forces, later U.S. Air Force, wanted all air defense elements under a single commander. Army wanted to retain its anti-aircraft artillery arm for point defense and the defense of its ground troops. In a reorganization of the War Department, the National Security Act of 1947 was passed by the Congress and implemented by the Executive Department in July 1947. The War Department was renamed the Defense Department. James Forrestal was named the first Secretary of Defense over the national military establishment, unifying the departments of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Joint Chiefs of Staff became a permanent organization. With the creation of the Air Force, the roles and missions of the armed forces within the newly created Department of Defense had to be clarified. In March 1948, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal called a conference at Key West, Florida. Over 4 days, a debate between the Air Force and Army took place. Secretary Forrestal made a Solomonic decision regarding air defense. The Air Force was to provide area defense, and the Army could keep its anti-aircraft artillery AAA functions for point defense. While this debate was going on, General Stratemeyer set about to begin planning an air defense network. He proposed 2 plans to the War Department in late 1946. In October and November 1946, Lieutenant General Stratemeyer submitted 2 proposals. The October proposal was a short-term plan that concentrated air defense forces in the Northeast and Northwest. The long-term plan presented to the Air Staff in the Pentagon in November 1946 was that the Air Defense Command was to get 38 aircraft control and warning groups, 34 fighter groups, and 300 anti-aircraft artillery battalions. To implement this plan required nearly 700,000 people. The events of February 1948 scared the West. In the memoirs of Khrushchev, he stated that the events of February 1948 in Czechoslovakia, when the working class came to power, frightened Britain, France, and the United States. The reconnaissance planes flew almost uninterruptedly. Such flights continued even after Stalin's death. Stalin died in March 1953. Eglin stated that it was not until after the Czechoslovakia coup of February 48 that any perceptible efforts were made in the direction of air defense within the continental United States. This was the spark that finally fired the plans being put forward by the Air Defense Command. Lieutenant General Stratemeyer was ordered on April 23, 1948, to establish with his current resources an aircraft control and warning system in northwestern and northeastern United States and the Albuquerque, New Mexico area in that priority. No additional funding was available, nor were additional resources available. The interim radar program called for 61 basic radars and 10 control centers to be deployed in 26 months, with an additional 10 radars and 1 control station in Alaska. The interim plan needed an additional shot of $44 million to get started in military funding. A supplemental appropriations bill was put before Congress in 1949 and was approved by President Harry Truman for an additional $85 million for construction funds to build the interim radar network and provide additional augmentation funding. The interim radar network was named Lash Up because the World War II radar equipment was literally lashed to temporary and hastily built wooden and steel radar towers to provide a temporary radar screen. By the end of 1948, the Air Force would have these temporary radar sites up and running. The Air Defense Command had a small and hopeful radar network by 1950. During the late 1940s, the continental United States was practically defenseless against air attack. Lash-up sites were designated L for lash-up and were numbered as they were inspected and accepted by the Air Defense Command. There were a total of 44 lash-up radar sites built between 1948 and 1950. While construction was beginning on the lash-up radar system, planning for a more permanent radar system was begun. The lash-up system was decommissioned as a permanent radar system went into operation by 1952. The history of the Air Defense Command states that in September 1948, USAF broached the suggestion that enough public work funds be allocated to deploy a permanent type radars on hand and on order. A lash-up radar screen was never meant to be around for long. A radar screen of 75 radar stations and 10 control centers was to be built to replace the lash-up radar system starting in 1950. The main workhorse radar of the new permanent radar system was the CPS-6 radar. The Air Defense Command history stated that by the beginnings of 1949, 2 sighting teams had been chosen and were on their way. These radar sites were designated P for permanent and were numbered as they were inspected and accepted by Air Defense Command. An Air Force history states that the first 24 sites were to be completed by July 1951. Because of the Soviet atomic bomb explosion in 1949, this timeline was moved up by 6 months, and the rest of the sites were to be completed by July 1952. The permanent radar system was also called the manual system of radar detection during the 1950s. Within this system, aircraft radar plots were tracked using grease pencils on a large plexiglass board in the front of the operations room of the operations building at the radar site. Radar operators had to determine direction, height, altitude, speed, and whether the aircraft was friendly, enemy, or unknown, generally within 1 to 2 minutes of the aircraft appearing on the radar screen as a blip or radar reflection. From there, they had to determine if it was a civilian or military aircraft and if its flight path correlated with available and known flight plans. If the aircraft was an unknown, within 5 minutes, an intercept aircraft or pair of aircraft, fully armed, scrambled from a nearby Air Force base to visually identify the aircraft. If the aircraft was determined to be an enemy, the interceptor pilot had authority to attempt to shoot down the enemy bomber or bombers by the rules of engagement. There was an obvious flaw in the radar screen in that most of the radars under the permanent system could not detect aircraft flying below 5,000 feet. To try and solve this problem, the Air Force called for a civilian force of 500,000 under Operation Skywatch in 1952. This became the Ground Observer Corps, or GOC. This was a passive form of detection. It was ineffective, and the information provided in its reporting of aircraft was useless. The GOC could only ever muster 387,000 civilians to watch for possible Soviet bombers. This is where the popular phrase, flying under the radar, came from. In December 1950, President Truman established the air defense identification zones off the Atlantic and Pacific coasts under Executive Order 10-197. In 1950, the U.S. Air Force asked the Navy to provide radar picket chips off the east and west coasts. The Navy only stated it could provide chips on an interim and emergency basis. An ADC historical study stated that in January 1950, Konak proposed establishing 8 picket ship stations. Air Force headquarters agreed to the requirement and suggested raising the number to 10 stations, 6 for the East Coast and 4 for the West Coast. 2 ships would be placed off New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, San Francisco, and Seattle. A test of the Navy radar picket ships and their role in air defense was conducted between February and March 1951, was called Operation Tuna off the East Coast. The ship's radar averaged a range of between 40 to 75 miles. The 26th Air Division, which ran the test, concluded that when a radar picket ship was at Point Tuna, it could provide warning of approaching aircraft over 200 miles from New York City. provided that communications were adequate to transmit the information. Poor ship-to-shore radio communication was the main problem. This exercise proved the concept that naval ships could provide additional warning time of enemy bombers approaching the East Coast. In March 1952, the Navy activated Escort Squadron Number 16. This naval picket ship squadron began operating off the East Coast within the Eastern Air Defense Force EADF area in June 1952. Navy Escort Squadron 16 finally filled out by November 1952 with its radar picket ships. The first two ships assigned were the USS Harrison and the USS Joyce in June 1952. The USS Strickland, USS Kirkpatrick, USS Pessenden, and USS Ottersetter were added in November 1952. Each ship was on station for a period of 2 to 6 days. The radar picket ship patrol area was described as a 50-mile diameter circle where the radar picket ship was never more than 25 miles from its control point on each of the 5 sites off the East Coast. In 1952, the Lincoln Laboratory staff at MIT suggested to the Air Force that permanent radar stations be put off the East Coast on modified oil platforms similar to those off the coast of Texas. In terms of the air threat of the 1950s, this meant a gain of at least 30 extra minutes warning time of an oncoming bomber attack. The Air Force agreed with this suggestion, and 5 Texas towers were initially planned for. In late 1956, Texas Tower number 1 and number 5 were dropped from the plans due to budgetary constraints. Texas Tower number 2 reported to the 762nd Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron at North Trujillo Air Force Station and became fully operational for the SAGE, or Semi-Automatic Ground Environment System, in September 1958. The SAGE system will be talked about below. Texas Tower number 3 reported to the 773rd Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron at Montauk Air Force Station and became fully operational for the SAGE system in April 1959. Texas Tower number 4 reported to the 646th Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron at the Highlands Air Force Station and became fully operational for the SAGE system in 60. Standing like a 3-pronged tuning fork, the towers resonated with noises that spread farther and amplified greater than originally occasioned by their source. Texas Tower number 4 was nicknamed Old Shaky by her crew. On September 12, 1960, Texas Tower number 4 was badly damaged by Hurricane Donna. Repairs were set for February 1, 1961. A crew of 28 people was left, 14 Air Force and 14 contractors. On January 15, 1961, Texas Tower number 4 collapsed in a storm with all hands aboard. The other 2 Texas towers were abandoned and dismantled in 1963. To push the warning time back, the Air Force built the Distant Early Warning Line, DEW, in northern in northern Canada, Mid-Canada Line and Pine Tree Line of radar stations across Canada in the 1950s. These series of radar stations would provide early warning radar tripwires of Soviet bombers attempting to attack the United States from over the Arctic. Additional warning time would be obtained from the various CIA and NSA listening posts around the Soviet Union built in the 1950s. Intelligence gathering as a mode of warning of a possible Soviet first strike is not explored in this thesis, but is encapsulated in command control, communications, and intelligence, or C3 cubed I. In a broad sense, it is part of the larger picture of the Cold War. The Strategic Air Command relied on the communications and intelligence aspect as part of its launch-on-warning capabilities. U.S. bombers were kept on loaded with nuclear weapons starting in 1954. Beginning in 1954, the quick strike capabilities of the Strategic Air Command was developed to the utmost. Nuclear bombs began to be stored on bomber bases, and the SAC alert concept was evolved, whereby approximately one-third of the force would be on a ready status at all times, with bombs and fuel loaded and cruised. In mid-March 1950, about 90 Mark IV atomic bombs without their atomic cores were given to the DoD, mainly for training purposes. It would not be for another year that 9 atomic bombs would be given to the DoD for full custody and control. This number would not change until 1954, when the DoD acquired 167 atomic weapons. By the spring of 1956, the procedures established for the transfer of atomic weapons from the Atomic Energy Commission to the Department of Defense in an emergency had become a matter of serious concern. A practice alert in June 1955 had demonstrated definite and potential serious delays in authorization and notifications procedures. The Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission both considered it essential that steps be taken to eliminate all sources of possible delay or